You're live.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this virtual symposium, Local Matters. Good morning. Thank you for joining us at today's event, where you will have an opportunity to hear from some really smart and well-connected individuals from the world of journalism and communications and community. It was nearly 2 years ago, in fact, 2 years ago this Sunday, that we lost Rebecca Smith, Wendy Winters, Rob Hyacin, Gerald Fishman, and John McNamara in the mass shooting at the Capital Gazette newspaper here in Annapolis. On that morning, I was meeting with Carl Snowden of the Caucus of African American Business Leaders here in City Hall. I'd been a mayor for about 6 months. It was my first elected office. An aide came into the meeting and told me there had been a shooting at the Capitol. At first, I thought it was the Maryland State Capitol. A while later, I learned it was the Capital Gazette newspaper. For every mass shooting in America, and there are far, far, far too many, there is an identity. Sandy Point had little school children and devastated families and parents. In Charleston, the attack showed the depths of hatred. At Stoneham Douglas High School in Broward County, Florida, it was high school students whose survivors went on to powerful activism. In Pittsburgh, the synagogue shooting was an assault on religious freedom. For Annapolis, our mass shooting was an attack on free speech. There was no reason for this shooting. After all, a community newspaper is made up of people. We know these people. We continue to know and work closely with the reporters at the paper. They are part of our community, an integral part of our community. Our city felt this loss deeply, but for the wider world of journalism, the 2018 attack felt like another blow on the institution of newspapers. Already reeling from reductions in ad revenue, from consolidations and acquisitions, with local papers shutting down due to financial constraints, the industry was strained. It was an industry feeling the strains in 2016 when a new kind of political candidate came on the scene, ready to make news organizations a scapegoat for what was ailing America. A free press, a local press, is integral to a well-functioning democracy. They hold people accountable, including politicians like myself. We need them. They don't go into this line of work for fame or the amazing paycheck. It is a career that most do because they have a passion for the work. I know that we will hear today from some amazing minds. They will likely won't fix what is happening in the news industry or the local newspapers. But today, we can shine a light. We can open a dialogue, and we can get people thinking about where we go from here. Thank you for joining us today. Now, I would like to recognize Selene San Felice. She's a Capital Gazette reporter, and she is joining us for remembrance.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you guys so much for having me here and for dedicating this time, not to just remembering our tragedy, but to also thinking about our industry. John McNamara's widow, Andrea Chambly, shared a memory with me yesterday that I wanted to share with you guys. She said that there was this one day that she was looking for a word to describe something. And you know how you get a word on the tip of your tongue and you can't think of what it is? And she was trying to think of something like the word loyalty, but that word didn't quite fit what she was looking for. So she turned to her husband, John, a writer, for synonyms. And one of the words that he threw out was devoted. And she said, that's it. And he asked what she was trying to describe, and she said, you. The morning of June 28th, Andrea said that John was exhausted. We had just covered an election 2 days before, and the two of them were so close to going on vacation. John and I had been talking about it for a really long time. He was so close. So what was the hurt if he was going to take one day off? But he told her he had to go in. Others were on vacation, and the Capitol needed him there. I watched John die later that day, so he never got his vacation. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, a man's character is his fate. Andrea told me that John's devotion was what killed him, but I'd argue that John's devotion is what's keeping his memory alive. I thought my parents would never let me leave the house after they took me home from the police station that night. But the next morning, they drove me to work at the Baltimore Sun because they knew that if I survived, my dedication would too. I had to carry that for John and for Rob, Wendy, Rebecca, and Gerald. There have been a lot of changes at the Capitol over the last couple of years. People have left for other jobs. Some found themselves having to take buyouts. But we've also gotten other new reporters who may not have known our friends, but they carry on the legacy of that dedication. Gerald's thoughtful editorials, Rob's knack for great storytelling, Wendy's passion for covering the community, Rebecca's care and endless patience for readers, and John's love of sports and devotion to covering the city of Bowie. Those are things that we can keep alive in the newsroom. We miss our friends, and all we can do is honor them with the work that we hope that they would be proud of. So for readers and the community, if you want to honor them with us, I ask two things of you. First, acknowledge that how they died was preventable. A man with a history of violent threats bought a shotgun and killed them in our newsroom. If you send us your thoughts and prayers, just as President Trump did that day, you should also take action. Ask yourself how you can stop more people from being killed in this way. Second, fight with us to keep our paper, your paper, alive. Powerful people dedicate memorials to us and our friends who were killed, but those memorials might soon be all that's left if those people in power don't invest in papers like the Capitol. Yes, we are in an economic crisis, but journalism is not dying. Corporate greed, prioritizing profit and shareholders over papers and reporters, is killing newsrooms like ours, and that too is preventable. If you want to keep reading the Capitol and you want to keep honoring Rob, Rebecca, Gerald, John, and Wendy, keep fighting for us, because we want to keep fighting for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Selene. Next up, we have Lucy Dalglish, who is a professor and dean at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland, our partner in organizing and presenting this symposium. She is the former executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, a former trial lawyer, and a reporter and editor for the St. Paul Pioneer Press. She has written and spoken on issues related to a free press and government transparency. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, thank you to the City of Annapolis for inviting Philip Merrill College of Journalism to participate in this important and poignant program on the future of local news. Thank you to Mayor Buckley and his staff, particularly Susie Smith and her spouse, Terry, for setting up this virtual program. We've discovered at Merrill College that people actually enjoy participating in virtual programming that is timely and interesting. As many of you know, Merrill College's Capital News Service has had a bureau in Annapolis for 30 years. Our students mostly cover state politics, including the legislative session. In fact, when the legislature is in session, our student bureau is larger than the rest of the Capitol Press Corps combined. It was by having that newsroom in downtown Annapolis that we were able to help 2 years ago when the Capitol Gazette murders occurred. The Capitol Gazette staff moved out of its devastated Bestgate newsroom and moved to our much smaller newsroom for the next 11 months. We are very proud that we were able to help, and we realize how lucky we were in some ways to have the professional journalists mixed in with our students. The students enrolled in the Capitol News Service capstone classes at that time got an upfront and personal look at what community newspaper means to its citizens. They were able to watch editor Rick Hutzel as he managed his team under extremely sad and horrifying days. The past few months of COVID-19 have introduced quite a bit of angst as internships have dried up. But we still have students hard at work learning how to cover communities. All of our students understand the need to inform citizens, hold the powerful accountable, and for this generation of students, this is the most important: shed light on the disadvantaged. One effect of losing so many community newspapers in recent years is that many of our students have never laid eyes on a local newspaper. They have no concept of what it means to cover a community. But when we're able to find them an internship in Dubuque or Hagerstown or Fauquier County, they are hooked by learning how to develop sources and write about the information needs of the people in that community. Those opportunities are drying up. I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce to you today the nation's leading expert on the state of local journalism. Professor Penny Muse Abernathy is the John S. and James L. Knight Chair in Journalism and Digital Media Economics at the University of North Carolina's Hussman School of Journalism and Media. Professor Abernathy is a journalist and author who specializes in studying news deserts, the frightening phenomenon where thousands of community newspapers have closed and thousands of journalists have lost jobs, and millions of citizens no longer have the access to the news and information they need to make informed decisions in our democracy. Between 1969 and 1984, Professor Abernathy worked at some of the nation's finest regional newspapers, including the Charlotte Observer, the Dallas Morning News, and the Wichita Eagle Beacon. From 1986 to 1999, she held various positions at the New York Times, including the Senior Vice President for Strategic Planning and Human Resources. She then was publisher of the Harvard Business Review and later moved on to the Wall Street Journal. You can see where she gets her outstanding background for the subject she has chosen for her academic research. She has written many books and reports, and she's the guru for those of us trying to figure out how to save and support local journalism. Her latest report on the state of local news was published this week and can most easily be found on the UNC Hussman School's webpage. Please join me in welcoming Professor Penny Muse Abernathy.
Thank you very much, Dean Dalglish. I'm very honored to be here and very honored to be asked to speak. My passion has always been in community newspapers because I was fortunate enough as a recent high school grad and as again 3 summers while attending college to have internships that introduced me to the incredible influence and impact a journalist and a local newspaper can have. It was the foundation of how I viewed everything since then, and it has really propelled the research that I have been able and fortunate enough to do at UNC with generous funding from the Knight Foundation, which has also got an initiative focusing on local news. Could we bring up the first slide? Great. I want to talk today about research that has been done in both the universities as well as in the industry in recent years that shows how important local news is to building community and nurturing our democracy. Think about it for a moment. We are a country of dozens of large cities and many, many small, mid and small size communities. So for us, the primary vehicle for understanding local news begins often with what we turn to in our local community. And historically, local newspapers have been the prime, if not sole source for understanding what goes on in our school board, what goes on in our county commissioner meetings, what goes on at town council meetings. Those are critically important for us as citizens and for residents in determining the choices that we make. Next slide. So why focus on local news? Well, there are three trains of thought that really, from various disciplines ranging from political science all the way over to public health, that really focus on why we need to have strong local news at the grassroots level. So historically, as I mentioned, the prime source for that has been newspapers in many ways because there were, as we say, more feet on the ground, more reporters to go to local county commissioner meetings. So community journalists have done three things through their coverage. First and foremost, they have historically set the agenda for debate of public policy issues, especially at the state and local level. Now, how do they do that? They do that by the stories they choose to cover. They do that by the play that they give their stories. And third, and I think which is something we need to keep in mind as we look ahead to where we're going, they do it by the editorials that are then published that advocate for change in a way that is advocacy but acknowledges both sides and what is at stake if we don't change. The second thing is that local newspapers and strong local news organizations encourage a strong regional economic growth. Now, one of the more obvious ways to do that is their advertising brings traffic through to local merchants, and it builds up the economic growth within a community. But also the journalism does that. A lot of recent research has focused on what happens when you lose a newspaper in a town, when you lose journalists who cover town hall or cover county commissioner meetings. And one of the astounding things they found is that in a very short period of time, we as taxpayers end up paying a lot more for the bonds that are issued, for the a whole range of things that finance our government, that provide funds for us. And then finally, local newspapers have historically provided a sense of social cohesion and social identity, geographic identity. Even in a digital age, most of what we do most of how we vote, most of how we identify ourselves depends on our geography, whether we're talking about economic disparity, whether we're talking about policies that will affect us on a day-to-day level. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about the news ecosystem as a pyramid, and at the base is roughly about 5,500 newspapers that what we would call weeklies and small dailies. Just above that are about 150 state and regional papers, and then at the very top are our national papers such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and increasingly the Washington Post. And think about what a strong base that is and how numerous the number is down at the bottom. So it feeds up through to the top. The New York Times ultimately depends on what the Capital Gazette writes in many ways to determine the agenda at the national level. And I want you to think about the loss of news in two ways. One is the loss of newspapers and one is the loss of journalists. Let's first turn to what's happened on the loss of newspapers. Over the last 15 years, we have lost a fourth of all our newspapers, and the majority of those have been in that very bottom tier. All but 70 were non-dailies or weeklies going forward. So that means we've lost the dailies across we've lost the dailies, but that has been a different sort of loss. Next slide, please. So what that has resulted in is that we now have more than 200 counties with no local newspaper whatsoever. We have more than half of our counties, 1,540, that have only one newspaper, and some of those newspapers are covering multiple communities within a county with as many as more than 1 million residents. And then we have more than 2,200, or more than 2/3 of our counties don't even have a daily presence of any sort to turn to for reliable news, for example, on the spread of a virus, or on what's happening with the economy, or more what's happening with local protests and the like. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at what that is, where that has been most effective, and this is the thing I think that should concern us the most, counties that have lost newspapers or have only one newspaper tend to be much older. The residents tend to be much older, much less educated, and alarmingly much poorer. As you can see, the poverty rate is more than 6 points higher than the U.S. average, 6 percentage points higher. And many of the places, such as Youngstown, that lost its daily newspaper last year, have poverty rates as high as 1/3. This speaks to the polarization of our country at a very local level. It also speaks to the increasing disparity that we see and the disenfranchisement of whole communities, of whole counties, of whole regions of the country. I want to pause for just a moment and say, what is a news desert? Our definition has increasingly changed to say a news desert is a place where residents have very limited access to the sort of news and information that feeds democracy, beginning at the grassroots level. And that lack of access can be caused by both a lack of ability to get high-speed internet, but more recently it's been caused by a total lack of news stories and news that they can access. Next, please. So what has caused all that? There are a number of things that have caused it, but most importantly, it's been the collapse of the for-profit model that sustained newsrooms, especially newspaper newsrooms, for more than a century, for almost 2 centuries, in fact. And that was the switch over to advertising from just subscription-based. Complicating that matter has been that Facebook and Google alone have somehow over the past decade begun to siphon off more than about 75% of the digital revenue, which means it leaves legacy media companies, whether they're TV stations, whether they're newspapers, or whether they are digital startups, literally fighting over the digital scraps. So we have lost one model and not yet developed another model. Next slide, please. Next. Okay, so at the same time, because of what we have experienced, it's quite common to have consolidation within an industry. And we now have the largest 25 companies in our country own more than 70% of all our dailies and more than 1/3 of all our weeklies. You can see where the concentration is strongest. And we've had another phenomenon, which was the rise of private equity and hedge fund owners who swooped in after the 2008 downturn to scoop up bankrupt companies and whole chains. And now they are merging with what we traditionally thought of as publicly traded companies like a Gannett, like a Tribune, like a Lee Enterprises, and bringing with them the business practices that they had before. And many of those business practices focus primarily on the bottom line and not on the journalistic civic mission. Next slide, please. So what we've also had is not only a loss of newspapers as a result, but also what I call the rise of ghost newspapers. We've had the loss of readers and we've had the loss of journalists. Over the past decade alone, and I'm sure Amy will speak to this more when she talks about the Pew Research that has been done, we have lost half of all our newspaper journalists. And most of the journalists that we have lost were the ones that were employed on the state and regional newspapers. State and regional newspapers have been very, very important for several reasons. One, they provided backup for local and regional, local and community newspapers in terms of going in and covering events that might have been difficult to cover. And secondly, they were the ones that typically covered the big beats that are important to us as citizens. Things like education, things like health and environment, things like the politics. And as a result, they've also been the ones that have typically provided investigative reporting that had the ability to change the lives of people in multiple counties, in multiple communities, and bring about state and national reform. Next, please. So who's filling the void? Our research includes not just newspapers, but also digital sites, public broadcasting, and ethnic media. You can go to our website, US News Desert, which has more than 350 interactive maps and drill down to the county level there. Unfortunately, what we found is that all of those organizations are trying very hard to fill the void, but are struggling for a lack of capital and a lack of money. So it gets back to the notion that we are in the process of trying to develop a new kind of economic support for newspapers, whether that's for-profit, whether that's nonprofit, or whether that ends up also being public funding, such as public broadcasting, to fill the void. Next, please. So in the end, I want you to think about what the FCC actually identified as the needs, the critical information needs that we need in a community. And they identified 8 categories of the sort of news and information that we need on a consistent basis. They help us live a great quality of life in terms of making decisions, first as individuals, but second as a community. And those 8 are listed up here. One of the things that we have done on this last report is compare what you would get, for instance, on a Facebook feed for your local news versus what you get on the daily newspaper. And that study has also been done at numerous universities. And what we find is that even in their diminished state, local newspapers still provide the majority of the critical information needs that we need. They typically, in a recent study done by Duke, found that more than 50% of the critical information needs a community gets comes from its local newspaper, and not from the television stations, but the regional television stations, in part because the regional television stations often do not cover communities just between in the suburbs. They cover the big metro area, and they also devote much more of their attention to other issues such as breaking news. Last, please. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It comes from the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and Democracy that was published a couple of years ago. And I want to end by saying our report ends by identifying 4 areas that we really need to think about in the coming year or two as we tackle what comes next for journalism. The first and most important one is journalistic mission. And I want to think about it in 2 ways. We are an increasingly polarized country. We're increasingly divided country between the haves and the have-nots, whether we're talking about whether you have news or whether you don't have news, whether you have access to high-speed digital or you don't. And that's also overlaid over that within 2 decades. The U.S. Census says we will be a majority-minority community. So we need to think about journalistic mission, about who is disenfranchised now, how we enfranchise more in order to build our democracy. The second thing is business models. We need to think, how do we create new business models that will support? My research has convinced me that if you are in a community that has average to above average growth and either economically or population-wise, and have a very smart, creative owner / founder / publisher of any kind of news site, then you have a pretty good chance of developing some kind of business model, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, or some hybrid of the 2. But we have yet to see a universal business model that looks at those economically struggling, disenfranchised communities and serves them as well. The third area to look at is technological capabilities. We have a section in the new report that looks at what happens when an algorithm is your editor, and the difference between that and having a human editor and a human journalist who's actually creating the stories. And then the final one is to think about what kind of policies at the local, state, and national level we need to think about in order to solve these problems. Most of our policies and regulations are built on the 20th century model, not the 21st century model. I want to end by saying we all have a stake in this, in whatever form the community newspaper is distributed to us in the future, whether that is in print, whether that is some kind of broadcast or in digital. We have a stake in it because it is important to our democracy, and it is also important to building the community that we want to live in and that provides us with the quality of life that we all aspire to. Thank you very much for this. Right now, I'm going to have the pleasure of and honor, quite frankly, of introducing Terry Smith. Terry is an award-winning journalist who worked for the New York Times, CBS, and PBS, and he's covered the world for the New York Times as well as the White House for the New York Times and CBS, and was the senior producer and media correspondent for PBS. Working for PBS NewsHour, Terry anchored a unit that reported on and analyzed media trends in the changing media landscape. So, Terry, I'm going to turn it over to you and the panel of experts to decide what we need to do next.
What a good question. Penny, thank you so much, and welcome to everybody. I want to thank you for a really comprehensive look at the dilemma that faces local news and beyond today, and a little note of hope there at the end that there is a path forward. We have a panel of experts coming from elected office, community activity, and journalism to talk about these issues, and I'll pose some questions, and I hope we'll be able to have some conversation among the five. The first is, I'll introduce, is Marty Kaiser, who was named the first managing director of the University of Maryland's Capital News Service at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism in 2019. He was editor and senior vice president of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel from 1997 to 2015. And under his leadership, the Journal Sentinel earned a national reputation for its journalism and its innovation. Kaiser's newsroom also won Pulitzer Prizes in 2008, 2010, and 2011, and was honored as a finalist 6 other times. So Marty Kaiser, welcome. I wave to you. We're all virtual here. So he knows what he's talking about firsthand. A second panelist is Stuart Pittman. Stuart Pittman Jr. was elected Anne Arundel County Executive after his first campaign for public office in 2018, just 2 years ago. He was born and raised on his family farm in Davidsonville. Stuart graduated from the University of Chicago and then went on to work as a community organizer. In that role, he built neighborhood organizations, confronted environmental hazards, and attracted private investment to blighted communities. And I'm going to guess, Stuart, I'm going to wave to you, that 2 years ago you had absolutely no idea when you ran for and won this office that you would be confronting simultaneously a public health crisis, an economic downturn, to say the least, and across the country, racial unrest and activity that I'm sure you couldn't have imagined. But welcome to this panel. I want to introduce as well the Honorable Carl Snowden is a native Annapolitan who was the first civil rights director for the office of the Maryland Attorney General. He served in the administration of former Governor Paris Glendening and was a member of the cabinet and former county executive Janet Owens. And in addition, Carl is the head of the African American caucus here in Anne Arundel County and is a consistent and valued voice in the community at large and specifically dealing with racial issues. Rick Hutzel is the next person I want to introduce. Rick is the editor of The Capitol, which, as you may know, in 2018 won a special mention from the Pulitzer Prize Committee for its performance after the shooting. The Capitol is part of the Baltimore Sun media group and therefore part of Tribune Publishing. Over his 32-year career at the Annapolis newspaper, he's been a columnist, editor of the historic Maryland Gazette, and was named editor of the Capital Gazette in 2015. And I'm sure, Rick, you had no idea when you took over that you would encounter first the horrific shooting and then the current situation, which combines all these challenges at once. Finally, on the panel, Amy Mitchell. She is Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center. Hi, Amy. She's responsible for the center's research related to news and information, including how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, and how technology is changing all of these elements. She specializes in how technology is changing the flow of news information today and the influence of political identity on news choices. I want to hear a little more about that in a minute. So let me start with you, Amy, if I may. Penny Abernathy paints a pretty bleak landscape for the situation that local news confronts. She calls it local news deserts. And so based on your research at Pew, what are the most destructive factors affecting local news today? Is it the technological change? Is it the change in reader habits, economic challenges, industry consolidation, all the things that Penny talked about? And how has the pandemic multiplied all these problems? Amy?
Thanks, Terry, and thanks so much for inviting me to join this panel today. It's a terrific topic to be discussing and a really important one. As Penny was discussing, local news is critical to the daily life of individuals across the country. We know people are keeping up with our local news very closely. We've got more than 8 in 10 that have been following the coronavirus crisis somewhat or very closely over these last months, including turning to their local media, turning to local elected officials for streams of news. In response to your question, it's hard to say anything except all of the above to a certain extent. One of the things we saw in a big local news study we did recently is half of US adults, roughly half, who say that most of the local news that they're getting is actually about an area that's outside their local area. So it's outside where they actually live. It's covering another nearby area, perhaps. And so certainly, the degree to which people are getting information about what's happening in their local area versus a relevant one has a lot of factors behind it. Some of that is closing of papers that Penny's talking about. A lot else is the gutting of the newspapers that are still there. Newspaper employment declined more than half between 2008 and 2019. The budgets have been cut even for those that are still there, while the pace of news has continued to grow. So when you talk about the influence of the pandemic and other types of breaking news stories, there is so much to try to keep up with on a daily basis as well, and for these reporters to try to cover, many of whom are now doing 3 or 4 jobs that used to go across a wider range of staff. So there are a number of factors that are at play here. We also know that people put very high importance on a sense of local connection from their local media. So a sense of connection to that community is something people have expressed a great deal of value and import in.
Right. I want to ask Stuart Pittman and Carl Snowden about that in a minute. But first, Marty Kaiser, drawing on your experience in Milwaukee and I guess Baltimore before that, does Penny's description of the state of local news sound painfully familiar? Or is it something that has come on in a great rush in the last bit?
Painfully familiar. I think it's been going on since the mid-90s. And how we deal with it is so important. I think I think Amy's done some research showing that I read about how so many people across the country don't realize what bad shape that is going on in local journalism and the crisis that's taking place. And it's, I think, very important that the public understand this. And I find it interesting at this time when the coronavirus outbreak, how local news has become more important than ever. You need to find out in your community what's going on, your specifics of what's happening with the virus and how it's being dealt with. And you can't get that from CNN. And you need to get it from your local news provider. I think what I've read is some trust is going up in local news. It's interesting that over the years, what I've seen a lot of research is that while it's like Congress, while people may not like Congress, they seem to like their local congressman. They may be frustrated with the national media, but there is some trust in what's going on in the local media. And how do we take advantage of this? And as we said earlier in the report that North Carolina's done, there's no silver bullet to do this, and I'd be glad to talk a little bit more about some possibilities going forward.
Well, thank you. I would invite others, if you want to comment or agree or disagree, if you raise your hand, maybe we can, through the marvel of modern technology, connect the two of you. Rick Hutzel, let me ask you, is the Annapolis Capital Gazette facing these same challenges? And how has the triple whammy, if you want to call it that, of the pandemic, the economic downturn, and the racial unrest that is roiling the country, those three things, how has that affected the situation? I suppose it's magnified it. And do you and your management see a path forward?
A lot of questions in there. I will say that we have had the same pressures that everyone else has had. You know, in 2009, we laid off half the company when we closed the press and closed our office in Glen Burnie and in Bowie, And through changes in ownership and through economic downturns over the recession, and we have declined in size. We have fewer reporters than we did a decade ago. The way we have tried to compensate for that as an organization is through partnerships. That's relatively recent. We have a partnership currently with ProPublica and Report for America. We also work more closely with the Baltimore Sun. In 2009, we were competitors. Tribune purchased us in 2014. And some of the things that we did, layout, other back of the room functions have merged. Some of our coverage has merged as well. Pam Wood is the State House reporter for the Baltimore Sun. Day in, day out, she also covers it for us. Pam's a former member of our staff who went to the Baltimore Sun about 8 years ago. So there have been efforts to compensate for diminished resources, diminished number of people. It doesn't make up for the things that we've lost. In terms of some of the other issues you raised, in terms of covering the Black Lives Matter movement, it has definitely sparked internal conversations about our role in some of the racism that exists in this community. We are having internal conversations about our coverage priorities. On June 21st, we published a lengthy editorial examining our history in some of this.
I think that was Rick, a remarkable editorial. I'm glad you mentioned it and mentioned the date, and I would invite people to look it up. because it dealt very candidly with some of the Capitol's racial past and said, in effect, you have to do better.
It's not just our past; it's our present too. We have. I can't do the exact statistics because we're talking about a very long time. But in my memory, and I've been here for 3 decades, we probably have the most diverse reporting staff that we've ever had, and yet none of my predecessors as the editors have been Black, and I do think that does make a difference. We got a letter in response to that editorial that was highly critical of us and said that people have been telling us we needed to change for years, and we weren't listening, and that it's disingenuous of us to say, tell us, what we need to do to change when people have been trying to tell us for years. It can be hurtful to hear that kind of criticism, but it is fuel for further thought on our part.
But that illustrates the connection between the paper and the community that was so dramatically revealed after the shooting 2 years ago. It's 2 years ago Sunday. This is yet another illustration of it. Let me turn to Stuart Pittman, the Anne Arundel County Executive, and ask you, Stuart, as an elected official, how important is local news in getting your message out? Right now, for example, you have to communicate complex public health decisions that you have to make, I guess, on almost a weekly basis. And you then have to communicate that to an audience that frankly finds the differences between the state and the county and the city sometimes very confusing and hard to follow. So I wonder how local news either helps or hinders you in doing your job.
It's essential. And I've thought about what life would be like without the Capitol, and it scares me. I would probably not be in his office had we not had a local newspaper. And it's not because they endorsed me. They actually endorsed my opponent. It's because I had about 1/3 of the money to spend on my campaign that my opponent had. And the Capitol helped get our message out as well as his message. So during elections, you read the coverage, and it is a trusted source for people to find out about what the candidates stand for. But now, as we're governing, it's really stark, the difference between what you read in the Capitol that's written by a trained reporter, who I might add isn't getting paid much. It's extraordinary how little they're getting paid. But it's also extraordinary how good they are. They come in and they learn about, they come from outside the county. They learn about our county so quickly, and they really dig, and they get to the bottom of stories, and people get that. And you compare that to what you read on social media about, for instance, the reopening that we're doing in the county compared to what the state is doing, or in coverage of the marches and protests in this county. We wouldn't know that Pasadena and Crofton and all over our little Anne Arundel County, people in neighborhoods are rising up and saying, let's put an end to racial injustice, if we didn't have a local paper covering it. I mean, I could go on and on with every issue, the budget, the process of building the budget. We put what we can out on social media, but we're competing against everybody else in that. And without a trusted source, without journalists who are trained and really do their research, and people know that and people accuse them of bias, and there may be a little bit here and there, but they really are getting to the core of the story. And I'm really glad to hear that there's research that shows people trust their local press much more than they do the big bad national press.
Well, that's very gracious of you, given the endorsement of your opponent, and appreciated, I think, by everybody. Carl Snowden, let me ask you, as a community organizer and one who's been around the track a time or two, I mean, how would you get your message out without local news. And tell me how well or poorly you think local news outlets have done in reporting the racial crisis that's racking this country right now.
Well, first, I want to thank Mayor Buckley for putting this forum on. It's an important forum and an important discussion. I want to also thank Phil Merrill College of Journalism for putting this on. This discussion is a discussion that has to take place all over the country. And I have a unique experience. I've worked in television. I worked with WJZ Television. I often tell people I knew Oprah Winfrey before she became Oprah. I worked in WNN radio station. I've written for local newspapers. So I have the perspective of understanding how journalism works, and I understand the value of journalism. It was Thomas Jefferson who I think raised the critical question: what would this society be like, he imagined, without newspapers and without the media? And my answer is, it would be very dangerous. As we look at the ways to solve the problems that are confronting America, and the media in particular, one of the things I would strongly encourage people to do is not look to government as a salvation for solving the problem with the media. It's important that the media be free and independent of government. We see governments around the world that controls the media, and that can have an incredible impact on what people see, read, and learn. Relevant to the whole issue of Black Lives Matter and the whole movement that's taking place in the country, I've been around long enough to be able to appreciate how much has changed. The editorial that Rick referenced is historic. It's important. A group of African-American organizations are going to be meeting next week to make an announcement. We're going to hold a press conference probably on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, using what the Capitol did as a model to talk about the media as a whole ought to do a re-examining of themselves. I've been around, as I've mentioned, long enough to remember when there was a Evening Sun, when there was a News American, when there was a Washington Star, when there were many small local Black newspapers that no longer exist. And the trend that we're moving from, where the larger media is focusing on stories that do not necessarily take into account the local events that are occurring, are very, very important that we stop that trend. We should be looking at ways to make sure that local media is, in fact, in existence throughout the country. And lastly, I want to just say this about the media in general. When you look at the great movements that have occurred in our society in the 20th century and the 21st century, quite frankly, had it not been for the media, there would be no Black Lives Movement. Had it not been for the media, there would not have been the great civil rights movement that Dr. King led. Nelson Mandela would have died in prison had it not been for the media. So I'm a great proponent of the media. I'm a great proponent of this notion of the First Amendment. And it's important that the journalists who died, who were murdered here in Annapolis, that we remember them by making sure that the legacy that they fought to preserve a free press remains intact.
Thank you, Carl. Do you want to give us the headline for what you're going to announce next week?
No, that would be, I think Rick would prefer the teaser than doing the story today. But there will be a group of leaders meeting this weekend, tomorrow, putting together an agenda. It will include the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus, members of the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus, the NAACP, the United Black Clergy, the caucus, and other organizations. But again, I want to personally, commend Rick. It was an internal analysis that they did in terms of the role that the Capitol played historically in racism. And again, many people don't know this, but I've been around long enough. I remember Phil Merrill when he first came to the Capitol. And Phil Merrill led one of the battles that we were involved in to integrate private clubs. And what a lot of people don't know is one of the reasons he got involved in that battle. He tried to apply for membership in the Annapolis Yacht Club. And because he was Jewish, he was denied. And he never forgot how it felt like, no matter how prominent he had gotten, that he couldn't get into the Annapolis Yacht Club, merely because he happened to be Jewish. And so it's those kind of people being involved in the media who understand the importance of having it be inclusive, is why I think we're better off today than we would have been.
Rick Hutzel, you want to respond to that?
I will say I think it's incredibly poignant that the Merrill School is named for Phil. Obviously, he donated to it before he passed away, and his support for journalism, in this community is important. I will say that Gerald Fishman would have done a better job writing that editorial.
Right. Well, Gerald Fishman was exceptional and is much missed. Amy Mitchell, let me ask you a question that applies not only to local media and national media as well, which is what effect is President Donald Trump having with his relentless assault on media as fake news, as enemies of the people, and he repeats it. And I wonder if, based on your research and the surveys you conduct, you can tell us what the impact of his message is. Is he getting his message through? Is he changing minds?
One of the things we've seen is certainly an agreement among the public that there is a great deal of tension between the news media and Donald Trump, and that tension is unhealthy for the country. So there is agreement as to that. There's partisan divides on who is causing more of that tension or is more of the problem there. But one of the other things we've seen is since the 2016 election, and so we've had political divides in views about the news media historically. Republicans have tended to be less positive, more negative about the news media broadly compared with Democrats. But what we saw happen after 2016, and this is not, necessarily directly connected to Donald Trump, but is at that time period during that election cycle where that partisan divide just grew dramatically. Where we went, if you think about that watchdog role, we ended up with a 47 percentage point divide in the value of the watchdog role in our country, which is about sort of the news media keeping an eye on elected leaders. And there had been some divide, but nothing close to that in the past. And that's just one example of sort of where the value and the attitudes about the news media has really seen an exacerbated political separation. And that's continued. So as we've continued to look to ask different types of questions, that partisan divide has, if anything, only grown more dramatic over the last 4 years. And one of the other things that's happening is in today's wide media environment, right, in terms of the types of sources that people have available for them to turn to, we're also seeing a lot of separation in where people are getting their news and information and who they're trusting, specifically when it comes to their sources of news. And we've been able to then tie people's main news sources, including, for example, during the coronavirus, including President Trump and the task force, as where somebody might rely on most for news about the outbreak, that their views and attitudes about that outbreak or about other events, depending on what we're asking about, are quite different than the attitudes for people who are turning to other types of news media. And around COVID, the COVID-19 crisis, that also included people that are relying heavily on the CDC and public health officials, people that are relying on national news outlets, mainly for their news and information, or local outlets, often have very different takes on the issues at hand, the severity of the outbreak, and other issues along those lines than those who are relying on Donald Trump and the White House.
Marty Kaiser, pick up on that. Same question, basically, because you have a perspective at the Merrill School, at the Capitol News Service, and based on your own experience. Is Donald Trump getting through to, in your opinion, to people? Is he overall diminishing the respect for news organizations, both nationally and locally?
Yeah, one of the things, Terry, that I've done since I left the Journal Sentinel in Milwaukee in 2015 is doing a lot of consulting with small news organizations, medium news organizations all across the country, speaking to state press associations. And what I find incredibly disheartening is some of these owners of small weeklies in small towns who are they don't write about national politics. They're not caught up on it. They're interested in the trust that they can get from their readers. And they come to me when we have these conversations, just frustrated that their reporters are getting painted like reporters from the New York Times or the Washington Post or people like that, that the president is going after. And that's not what they're about. And their trust in their community, as I said before, has to do with their local ownership. And as I think about where we go forward, everybody knows there's no silver bullet to deal with some of these issues, but on and on, we know from all the research, the importance of local journalism to democracy, and we got to get people to understand sort of what they're losing. Carl mentioned the fear of government support, and I understand that. I did some work in in the Balkans, and that was really scary what was going on with their governments. But then if you look at other democracies around the world, we give the least amount towards public media. So there's some growth right now in radio and PBS and what they're doing. There's some growth in non-news organizations, but they're struggling. I wish there were more places where there was a private owner in a city who cared about it. I worked for a long time at a news organization that never, ever bought another newspaper around the country because it felt there's something wrong. You shouldn't own a newspaper where you don't live. That way you won't be responsible to anybody else but the local citizens. You have to live there. You have to work with them. You have to have feedback from them. Now, that all changed. Unfortunately, the company goes public, and next thing you know, shareholder value becomes more important than the readers. And Penny talked about this with these national equity groups coming in and just driving cash out of these news organizations and just decimating them. And so we've got to look for a whole bunch of different ways to address this.
We're getting some questions from viewers, and so I'm going to mention one, and Stuart or Carl, you might comment on this. It's from, incidentally, Andrea Chambly, the widow of John McNamara, one of the victims in the shooting 2 years ago. And she's asking, can you comment on how much of this is true for non-print media, like radio, and I suppose television and online? And so is that, maybe actually Amy, you might start us off on that question.
Sure, and I'm thinking she's asking about the economic challenges and closures. Not true. The newspapers have been hardest hit. They were hit first because the transition to digital was first text. So the newspapers were hit first and were hit hardest and have only continued to be further impacted because there's no new economic model. And that transition to digital has only furthered. And even though most people now, a large segment of newspaper readers are going to the digital products, there's not an economic system to support that, economic structure to support that. If you look at sort of employment numbers, the digital has actually grown largely because there are new digital entities that are being created, but some of the largest digital natives in terms of audiences actually had experienced quite significant layoffs. In 2017, we saw about 20% of the 50 biggest that we were looking at that experienced layoffs, another 17% in 2018. So they're being challenged as well because there's not an economic structure really to support their efforts either. The employment and in television in particular has been more stable. over, the last several years, if you look at the trajectory of those figures.
Well, there have been cutbacks there as well. But there are a couple of allusions here in your answers to this very controversial question of public support for, and by that I mean taxpayer support, for news organizations. And for a little context, remember that government already provides financial assistance to news organizations. Everything from favorable postal rates to the $400 million a year for public broadcasting that Congress passes, usually with some bitter argument. And incidentally, that $400 million sounds like a lot of money, right? It works out for $1.35 per person per year in the United States. And by contrast, I jotted this down, in the UK, it's $100 a year per person per year. And get this, in Norway, of all places, it's $176 per person per year with public support for all kinds of news organizations, including broadcasting. So the question first to Stuart, I guess, is what do you think about that? What do you think are the pluses and minuses? What are the dangers? People always worry that it will compromise people's, the independence of news organizations, and maybe Rick or Marty might be and Carl. So tell me what you think.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question, because throughout, in thinking about this session and during it so far, I automatically think, okay, what if we do end up with the Capitol in serious trouble and they're not going to continue? What would we do in Anne Arundel County? And my answer is that we would have to convene a group of people to explore the possibility, at least, of some public support. And people do trust public media, National Public Radio to some degree, and Maryland Public Television. People are okay with that. I think Amy can confirm that.
What? I think Amy can confirm that the trust level for NPR and I think PBS is quite high. Go ahead.
But the two downsides, one is cost. Nobody wants to spend their own money on much of anything, really, and they want free media because they're getting used to that online. But the other is control, and I don't support the idea of a county executive getting to decide in their budget how much money a local newspaper gets. I think then the local newspaper editor, Rick Hutzel, would be beholden to Stuart Pittman, and I'm sure he doesn't want that, and I don't either. But if there were an independent body created that somehow was separated from the politics, like we have bodies that do a pretty good job of that now, I think that there really ought to be a conversation, if we get to that point, about whether some public support should be provided. And I think it makes a lot of sense. When I look at what we spend in county government, just on our public information officers in our various departments, and then I haven't seen the budget for the Capitol, and actually I'd be interested in seeing what their annual costs are. I think the Capitol is a very good investment for the health of our county. So I'd be open to the conversation.
Let me tell you why I raised the concern. And again, it's one thing when you've been around and you understand, as I have, civil liberties and what happens. I mean, we're watching things unfold right in front of our very eyes. President Trump has shown us, he took out the World Health Organization. He defunded that. The World Health Organization. We had a president by the name of Richard Nixon who created an enemies list. Can you imagine what would happen in this country if the media was dependent on government? Could you imagine what would happen if Donald Trump could actually have the power to control what the New York Times would report, or the Washington Post, or the Capital newspaper for that matter? I think there's a reason why the founding fathers were very clear that we want a free press. Thomas Jefferson said if he had a choice between a free government or free press, he'd take the latter every time. Government by its very nature is not one that we should suspect are angels. I worked in government. I know what government can do. I know the good things it can do, but I also know, given the wrong people getting elected to public office, the tremendous power it can have and the effect it can have on people. I think there are ways of billing out the media, and I think there are ways of doing it where you don't necessarily threaten the independence of government. While it is true that the kind of examples you've cited, public radio, who, by the way, even public radio has been threatened by political forces within government who don't like the way they report it, and it has had some impact on what gets reported. But, you know, we may have to look at new models. Nonprofits may not be out of the question. One of the things that we all remember, that there was a time that we got our communication by way of the telegraph. Telegraphs don't exist anymore. We have a way of adjusting in our society. I don't think we should write off American ingenuity on this particular problem. The media is changing, it will change, and it should change. We're going in the 21st century, and the way we report news and gather news is going to be a lot different as a model than it was a decade ago. And it's changing every day. So
Carl,
I would just caution people not to look at the notion that government is our salvation.
All right, Carl, I reject the notion that you're old enough to have ever used the telegraph. I am, but you're not. Rick Hutzel, we need to hear from you in response to the points that Carl and Stuart just made, and also to this question, which has come in from a viewer. Lisa Hillman writes that she is worried about further loss of local journalism. She asks a specific question. I don't know if you know the answer. If the Baltimore Sun goes nonprofit, like the NPR model, perhaps, will that cover the Capitol? So there are a couple of questions for you, Rick.
So let me address the first issue. First, the issue of buying the Baltimore Sun, and I know that there is an effort to find people to try and buy it from Tribune. I was reading a story about it today. I'm not involved in those efforts. I'm not involved in the discussion of them. I don't know what the response has been from the company. My personal opinion is that it is highly unlikely that the owners, the shareholders of Tribune will break up a company that, they're trying to build critical mass in terms of eyeballs nationwide to be able to make revenue. I also think it's, my boss likes to say that, if someone comes in and, says, I want to buy these, we're going to listen. I think that's the philosophy. I don't know anything more about it than that. I do know that when we closed our printing press in 2009, we were renting space on a printing press company that I believe has been sold and resold twice because of the change in publishing. As we have merged with Baltimore Sun Media and the Tribune, many of the services that allow a business to function independently are now not only part of the Baltimore Sun, but they're also part of Tribune. So our payroll checks come from another part of the country. They're not even checks; they're deposited directly, obviously. Our billing is done in a different part of the company. As with any corporation, there are economies of scale that you get through these kinds of combinations of different elements. So the notion of anyone buying the Capitol, like I said, I'm sure the company would entertain someone with significant resources who wants to do it, but it would be untangling a lot.
What about, let me ask you this,
I just want to address one of the things Mr. Pittman said. I do think that there are things government can do to support news media. They can stop trying to move public notice from independent sources of information to their own websites. In just the most recent General Assembly, a bill that got approval from the vast majority of local delegates would have moved advertising about liquor licenses from publication in the Capitol, print publication, to some corner of the Anne Arundel County Liquor Board website. I would like to know how many people who are listening have ever been to the Anne Arundel County Liquor Board website. It's actually the Board of Beverage License Control. And so this is a small source of revenue for us. The loss of it is not going to make or break us. We have argued that public notice for issues of importance to the community should be dealt with by third parties, because we guarantee that it will be in a way that readers can consume it. There are other efforts to stop other public notice. It is an important part of what we do. It is not just a matter of revenue, but it would be taking revenue away. I think that if the county executive wants to commit to not supporting efforts to removing public notice from newspapers, I think that's a great thing he can just do to support the financial future of the paper. And then the final thing, I will say that newspapers have evolved over the last century. It's not just the last 20 years. It's not just the 10 years. The study that we're talking about clearly indicates that we are going through an accelerated evolution. But newspapers have changed from the very beginning. Just in the 20th century, you saw the rise of industrial newspapers as industrial cities began to come together. You saw mergers happening through the 20th centuries. And I think newspaper owners in the early 20th century got lazy. I think it started then. I think they had a lock on a revenue stream. And I think in the early part of this century, they did not respond quickly enough to the economic model. I have confidence that the building blocks of what we do, public information, questioning authority, asking questions that our readers want asked, going places that our readers would like us to take them. I think those things have value. And even if the business model we are currently in does not survive, there is going to be some person in the American system of capitalism that sees value in this, that is able to put it together in a way that is successful. It may not happen while I'm at the Capitol, but I have some very smart, young, dedicated journalists who work for me, and I believe it will happen in theirs.
That's an encouraging thought. Very quickly, we're running out of time here, but Marty Kaiser, what's your perspective on this question that Stuart has raised and Carl has commented on about, in effect, government subsidy or support for news organizations, plural, newspapers, public radio, et cetera? What do you see as the pluses and minuses?
I think there's, as I said, there's no silver bullet. I think there's got to be more public support. I understand exactly what Carl's talking about, the danger there, but we've got to figure out ways to build firewalls. Rick mentioned public notices. They're being stripped away from newspapers all over the country. I think we also need, as I said before, to get out the message to the public across the country of the importance. I think Amy may be able to speak to this, but I've read of studies that showed that as you cut back coverage of local and state politics, it leads to less civic engagement in the community. As there's less coverage of what's going on in local government, that increased taxes have taken place after that. So the understanding of getting people to understand what's important and ways to do it. Also, other ways the government spends, I think, close to $1 billion a year doing advertising on things like the census and joining the military. Well, how about advertising in newspapers with health ideas and things like that they can direct them to help do them? It's going to take lots of small things moving forward to make a difference.
There is a bill, Marty, there is a bill in Congress now that would direct the government, the federal government, to direct more of that $1 billion a year in advertising to local news organizations. And that's an interesting thing. Amy Mitchell, will you pick up on that and the questions that Marty raised?
Sure. We certainly see that people who are more closely tied to news, that they're following their local news more closely, are also those that are more civically engaged in the local community. So there's definitely a connection between keeping up with news and what's happening and being personally engaged in your community. One of the other data points I'll throw out there when we talk about the value and public awareness is that when we did a very large study of local news habits across the US, and 70%, when we ask how people think their local news is doing financially, 70% think that their local news media are doing well financially, either fairly well or very well financially. And when we ask who's paid for news in the past year, local news in the past year, whether it's a membership, a donation, a subscription, only 14% of US adults responded that they had paid in any way for news in the past year. And the reason is because there's so much that's free that's out there. That's the biggest reason they give. But there's also what we see as that lack of awareness in terms of the challenge that the local industries may be facing financially.
Stuart Pittman, when you look at the horizon, and let's take Rick Hutzel's assurance that the Capitol will be with us in one form or another. What ultimately is going to save local news? Is it going to be digital sites or nonprofits or government subsidies? Give us your view anyway of the end of the road. Oh, you're muted, I guess.
But I can't say whether government subsidies are gonna save. I sort of doubt that. I think that they're saving themselves to some degree when they're smart about adapting and doing the work that they're doing digitally. I think most people read the Capitol online now. I certainly do, as well as even doing some video production, which the Capitol does some of, and competing. And I think that there's a clear need for it. I mean, I would like to see more public advocacy on behalf of the cause. I thought you were going to ask me to respond to the challenge I was just given, but I'll get back to Rick on that.
I got the impression that
I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good answer for you on that. What the future is going to hold.
Marty Kaiser?
In responding to what, I didn't hear what your question was, I'm sorry.
Well, look down the road here. Tell us what you see in terms of local news in the years ahead, and what you think will, in effect, save it.
I'm very concerned. On my good days, I see the enthusiasm of young people getting into it, partnerships that are taking place, things like what we're doing at Capitol News Service, figuring out ways to cover state capitol. I know of a group in Milwaukee called the Neighborhood News Service that's covered underserved communities in Milwaukee, low-income neighborhoods that were not even covered very well by the Journal-Sentinel when I was there, but now through funding through Marquette and private funding. So I want to be optimistic about those kinds of things. The point about that Amy was bringing up, we need to let people know what is being lost and to get at how do people, pay for the difference of what's going on in their community, because it's going to make a difference in their taxes, it's going to make a difference in the quality of their life. And it's such an important part of democracy.
Carl Snowden, I can see you nodding, so pick it up.
I actually agree with that. I also, on this eve where we're going to be remembering the anniversary of those who died, I remember a conversation. I used to do a column with the Capitol newspaper, so I've had an opportunity to have conversations with Gerald Fishman, and was really a great editor, and kind of looked at the world differently. And I remember one of the questions you had asked when this program got started, which really put me in a real reflective mode. You said when Stewart got elected and when Gavin got elected, Neither of them could have predicted we'd be faced with the kind of circumstances we're faced with today. As someone who reads history, I often sees parallels in history. Some of you know my mother lived to be 104 years old, and my mother would always remind me about how history has a way of repeating itself. In some ways, what we're faced with in the media is not new. There have been challenges with other industries in the past, and we as a society has risen to those challenges and have been able to make the adjustments. I have a lot of faith in the American people and in our ingenuity. I don't think this is the end of the media. I think there will be some adjustments that will be made, and I think we'll have a better product in the end. And I just want to take this one moment to really thank two people who made it possible for this memorial that we're going to do to these victims to be done. One was Juanita Cage Lewis, another is Dee Goodwin. When Wendy Winters, who was one of the persons who died, they both knew her. This was not somebody who was some stranger. This was somebody we, as a community, knew very well. And what was really, I think, encouraging, remember, this is 2 years ago. A predominantly African-American community and organization said we ought to honor these journalists and the staff at the Capitol. And you heard Rick talk about the history of the Capitol and how many perceived it to be racist. And that's true. Right. But there were people who worked for the Capitol that people had a very good relationship with. They considered them friends. And so when they were slain, people from that community came and said, we need to do a memorial in their honor. Now, I'll never forget at a meeting I was at, a white woman came up to me and said, none of the persons who died at the Capitol were African-American. Why would you guys be concerned about doing a memorial? And it was at that point I understood. She didn't understand that this was not about white people and black people. This were people who had given a major contribution to our community. And we wanted to remember them.
All right.
Because they were great journalists.
Carl, thank you. And I wanted to have a final word from everybody, but I'm getting the virtual hook here. And so it is time to wrap it up. I appreciate the thoughts. I hope Rick is right that the Capitol will be here for a long time and that we, in one form or another. I also want to thank the brains of the operation here, the tech team, Mark Hildebrand and Julian Jack, who have kept us more or less organized. So my thanks to all of you. Do we have the mayor coming back on? There he is. It's a miracle. And Lucy. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
So I just want to say that these conversations, they give me hope. You know, now more than ever, we need a trusted source of news. And as you can see from today's conversation, there are people that would lay down their life for the Capitol, even if they don't support us sometimes. I know that we can't count on social media as our trusted news source. There's no fact checking. There's no editors. The things that we need reported on, such as a noose in a high school or a middle schooler that organizes a rally against guns, that's only going to be covered by local newspapers. And they're the sorts of things that make people get up and march, and they're the sorts of things that make change happen. So I'm encouraged. There's a lot of allies here that will fight to the death for this paper. So thank you.
Thank you all.
And I'm just going to wrap it up with one announcement, Terry. So thank you all for participating. All of your comments have met our expectations, and I'm looking forward to what we accomplish going forward. I also want to announce that with the help of Carl Snowden and the Caucus of African American Leaders, County Executive Stuart Pittman and Governor Larry Hogan, the city of Annapolis will be the site of a memorial to the 5 people killed at the Capitol Gazette. It will be a park along Compromise Street next to the water. At this time next year, we'll be celebrating the unveiling of this memorial. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. This was an important conversation.
Thank you all.